Classes are the backbone of object-oriented programming, and anyone who has ever taken a computer programming course would definitely know what a class is. It's this template that lets you create objects out of it, and you can find it in almost any big programming language like Java or C++. But what about JavaScript? Yes, JavaScript did introduce the class keyword in ES6, but it's not exactly what you think it is. We'll be unmasking this imposter in this video. So let's first establish the fact that there's no such thing as a class in JavaScript. This class that you think of is just a special function behind the scenes. So if I console log the type of a class, you'll see that it returns a function. So if I just simply create a class, it tells me that it's a function. This is the reason why people say that classes in JavaScript are syntactic sugar, which basically means a different way to represent something, which in this case is a function. So this is what a basic class syntax is going to look like. We create a class by providing a name after this class keyword. Inside the block, you will find the code related to this class. The first thing that you'll normally see in a class is this constructor function. The constructor function is executed whenever you create an instance of this class. So on this line here, with the help of the new keyword, I create an instance of this profile class. And whenever I do this, the constructor function is executed. You can also attach methods on a class. So the instance that you create out of this class will now be able to use this method. So the user instance that we create out of the profile class will be able to use the greeting method on the profile class. Pretty straightforward. Now if you have watched my previous video on prototypes, we achieve something similar with the engineer function. That's because, again, coming back to my previous point, classes are essentially functions inside JavaScript. So this whole example can be rewritten using functions. Now this piece of code achieves the same thing as we saw in the class example, but in this case, we use a function. So behind the scenes, a class is converted into a function. The constructor function inside the class is equivalent to the main function here. Which is why, if you remember, I called the engineer function a constructor function multiple times in the prototype video. Any other methods that you would want on your objects, you'll have to attach those methods to the prototype of the function. So in this case, the greeting method that we had inside the class, we are just attaching the greeting method to the prototype of the function. So essentially, when you write this piece of code, behind the scenes, this is what JavaScript is converting it into. So if you want to verify this, I'll just simply comment this out. I'll uncomment this block. So now my class code is working, and simply console log profile.prototype. Now if I save this and go back to my browser, I'll see this thing here, this object. So this object is basically the prototype of the class that we created. If I open this up, you can see that the constructor points to the class itself, and there's this greeting method attached to this prototype. So as I had mentioned earlier, any method that you want on your class, behind the scenes JavaScript just attaches it to the prototype object, which is what is happening over here. Now it's not all just a syntactic makeover. There are a few minor things that you additionally get when working with classes. For instance, methods inside a class are not enumerable. I have a video on different types of loops in JavaScript wherein I had explained what enumerable properties were. You should definitely check that out. Basically, properties that can be accessed when iterating over an object are enumerable properties. Methods in the case of a class are not enumerable. So this method over here will not be part of the properties of this user object. So normally to check the properties inside an object, you use the for in loop. So we'll do just that. Now if I save this and run it in the browser, you can see the first name and the last name property that is attached to the object instance, which is part of the class basically, is what you get inside this for loop. Now, if I just copy this here and paste it down here, I'll comment this out and uncomment this. I don't need the greeting. So now instead of having the class code active, we have this function simulation of a class, and we are trying to do the same thing. We are iterating over each property of this object that is created out of this function, constructor function. Now if I save this and run it in the browser, you will see that it also console logs the greeting method. So greeting in this case, which is attached to the prototype, is also an enumerable. So this is what I was talking about. Any method that you have inside a class will not be enumerable, whereas when you try to do that with a normal function, you attach it to the prototype. So the foreign loop basically takes a look at the whole prototype chain and console logs, in this case console logs all the properties that are enumerable. The enumerable flag for this greeting method that we attach to the prototype is set to true by default, which is why you can see the property inside this console log. One more important addition to classes is that whenever you run anything inside this body, the class body, it will be executed in strict mode. So this assures increased performance, and the silent errors that you normally don't get in sloppy mode will be thrown in this case because this block is executed in strict mode. You can also use the static keyword to create static properties and methods inside your class. Static properties and methods are not specific to an instance of a class. These static properties are bound to the class themselves, which is why you cannot use them on objects. So I have removed the greeting method and instead I have added a static property over here. So when I create an instance of the class, now if I try to access the static property on this class instance, I'll get an undefined. This is because it's not present on the instance itself. And if you actually want to access the property, you can do it by passing in the class instead of the instance. So I pass the class directly and I get the config. So when you want to have a variable that always has the same value for every object of the class forever, make it static. And also if you have methods that do not use any instance variables or instance methods, you should probably make it static. The same thing can also be achieved in a function. So in case of a function, if you want to have static properties, or not exactly static properties, but like a simulation of a static property, you can directly attach it to the function itself. So in JavaScript, since functions are also ultimately objects, you can attach properties to the function. If you do this, this will act as a static property, and you can verify this by accessing it through the instance first and then try to access it through the class. And as you can see, we have undefined first and then the actual config. So yeah, that's that. And we also have an extends keyword in case of classes, which lets you inherit properties from a different class. This can also be simulated using the prototype chain. I've already covered it in detail in the previous video, so you can check that out. And yeah, that's pretty much it. The basic idea behind introducing classes in JavaScript was to make it more developer friendly for people coming from other object-oriented languages. Now from a usage point of view, you can use any of these methods as long as you know the difference between them. If you have any doubts or suggestions, do leave them in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.